The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me again this week. We are diving again into the world of Mormonism, and boy, do we have some things to talk about. I mentioned in my last talk on this and in social media since then how illuminating and sort of expanding this has been for my own point of view about the dangers and cultism of the Mormon Church. I am now absolutely convinced, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that this group is a destructive cult on the same order as Scientology. They are not, as I have said before, sort of a late-stage cult that's blooming into mainstream religion status. I had a few things wrong about that and about my views of their cover story. You know, maybe I bought into a little bit of their cover story. And so, I'm happy to admit that I am wrong about things when I am. And so I've always called it a cult. So at least I wasn't that far off the rails, but it's pretty bad. And so this week I am again welcoming Shannon Grover and Bryce Blankenagel to discuss the Mormon Church and their experiences with it. They are hard-hitting social media activists kind of thing, like I am when it comes to cults. Now, and they're much, much more steeped in the history, lore, and background of the Mormon Church than I am. So I'm thinking that we are going to be doing multiple episodes discussing all of this. So welcome back to the show, guys.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to have you. Okay, now there's so much to discuss. And I want to lead today with, I took this week and I read a fairly interesting and extensive document called Letter to CES Director. And what is CES? I want to get that out of the way right away first. What is that?
That's the church education system. And so, yes, that's a calling and a committee really that's made up of 70s and of a few of the 70s. And they are in charge of the entire education system of the church, which includes all of the BYUs. It includes all the seminary teachers, all of that. So they determine what is being taught.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. It was just a little bit of a question because obviously it's right in the title. And this was a letter written by a man who was on the fence and quickly kind of got off that fence after he got all these facts and information. But he basically data dumps, like 80 pages of graphics and illustrations and history and knowledge about current and former practices of the Mormon Church, the hypocrisy, the lies, right, the active deception about its history. And that's nothing new for cults, of course, but it's so well documented in this thing. And I wanted to ask you guys first, how is this document thought about within the ex-Mormon world? Is it useful for ex-members to read when they're coming out? Is it useful for people like me who are curious about, well, what's really going on here? And I can't go to the Mormon Church and get all the straight dope. Is this kind of concentrated truth about this thing, or how is this thought about?
Oh my God. It's like the biggest thing.
It's a meme in our world.
It is a meme. Yes. And it's like people, ex-Mormons, when they are in a hotel and they find a Book of Mormon inside of next to the Gideon Bible, in the nightstand, they will write in it, read the CES letter instead of this, read this. Mm-hmm. And they'll put the website that you can go read it at, everything. No, it's huge. And a lot of it is because, one, it validates every one of us, because every one of us expressed at least a few of those doubts or thought some of those doubts and felt guilty for feeling those doubts. And that's huge. I mean, because Jeremy Reynolds, that's who wrote it. it is a fantastic piece of work. He had some doubts. The person he was talking to said, "Well, you know what? Write a letter to the CES director, because and blah blah blah," thinking, a little one-page letter. They weren't expecting this, and I don't think he was expecting it to be that long when he got started. But it kept, and he just ended up listing all of them, and no one answered him. He ended up, because it ended up out, other people saw it and everything, and they were like, "Yeah, I have the same questions. Yes, I have the same questions." And he ended up getting excommunicated for asking questions.
Exactly.
Well, it was very beautifully done on his part, because he was called into a court of discipline and he recorded it surreptitiously, which is a huge no-no in the church, which you understand. Cults want to be secretive about their disciplinary practices. But he recorded it, and just an unbelievable line comes out of it when he was giving his closing statement of it. He says, "I am excommunicating the church out of my life." And he mic drops and walks the fuck out of there. I mean, it's really, really amazing. But why it is so powerful is because it is just all of the popular Mormon history. And I use this term in an academic sense, but the anti-Mormon history contained within it is very short, very concise, very punchy, and it's polemically written, very, very. Jeremy Reynolds is a computer programmer, right? So he thinks in logic forms. If then, he wants everything to make logical sense. So he lays out the historical problems that he saw and says, presents if then statements. If this is the true church, then why would this be the case? If this is not the true church, then why did they do this? So on and so forth, right? So it's very, very straightforward, very, very punchy, and it's full of very identifiable and very easy to understand Mormon history.
Exactly.
And it's very helpful because, I want to incorporate something that Shannon brought up last interview, shelf items. He is vocalizing every single shelf item that almost any Mormon has had at any point. Anything that they thought was a doubt, that they can just put it on a shelf and close the closet, and they'll come back and it'll be gone.
Feel guilty for thinking about it. Yeah,
feel guilty for exactly. He just says, "Hey, look, no, the shelf is full," and a lot of Mormons, ex-Mormons, will say that the CES letter was what broke their shelf, or they gave it to their spouse or to their parents or to their kids or to whoever. They gave it as a gift, and that caused that person to have a faith crisis or whatever. It is, I would say, probably the most impactful modern document or expose that we have on Mormonism.
Yes.
Awesome. That's awesome. There are so many parallels in Scientology that I want to get to, but I want to kind of talk about this some more. It's a published document. You can get it as PDF on the internet for free. He even gives you conditions on using it, which is basically none. Just, don't call it yours.
Right.
Otherwise, please get this out there. There are a lot of bits and pieces to it, and it's interesting to me also how he starts off, how he becomes the writing becomes more emotional.
Yes.
To the end, he starts getting pissed. He's like, yeah. And I would too, because after, about 60 pages of laying all this out, you realize the extent of the deception, or the con, if you will. And it's not really right to say it's a con. It's a series of cons. It's a pile of them. There are a number of things that the church is misrepresenting itself about, or misrepresenting historical facts about, or its financial situation about. I mean, there's a lot of different bits and pieces to this. Let's talk a little bit about this thing called hagiography. I love throwing that word around. It's an academic term I learned when I did my degree, so I get to use it. And it really is just a word to say the biography of a religious figure as told by the religion itself, right? So it's going to be a biased, exaggerated, hyperbolic, even delusory account of religious figures. We have these for, Jesus, for Muhammad, for every Buddha, for every single religious figure in the world who's ever lived. We have a life story for them. And when the church or group that they were founding or, ran tells that story, they always tell it in the most favorable light and all of that kind of thing, But it's a religious thing. It's not just any biography. Hagiography has to do with religious figures, right? So it seemed the hagiography, you could say the official church biography of L. Ron Hubbard, as told by the Church of Scientology, is a work of fiction that rivals L. Ron Hubbard's fiction. I mean, it is quite extensive in its creative history. They wipe out people who were in his life. One of his wives just ceases to exist. Children cease to exist. Actions he took are reframed or changed around completely, so that he was always the good guy, always fighting the good fight from a very young age. Always had it in mind that helping people and changing mankind was his life goal. They lay it on pretty thick. It seems to me from what I've read in this letter to the CES director and other sources that the hagiography of Joseph Smith and other prophets like Brigham Young are just as carefully crafted works of fiction rather than the actual historical truth. And one of the things that's really grated on me about it is, in Scientology, you can go, well, there's this little group of people who want to have these little, crazy ideas about their founder. Of course they do. And so they can believe that and close themselves off. It somehow seems harder to believe that scales, that more and more Mormons would do the exact same thing and just buy into this crap when the historical record is so available, so obvious. There's whole Wikipedia pages about this. It's not hard to find. So what are they told that is so convincing to them? What is the church hagiography that they are accepting and believing that this letter and folks like you are challenging? Let's start there.
Well, I think it would be very, very helpful if, Shannon, you tell us how Joseph Smith is taught about in the church. Because I call it consistently the cardboard cutout of Joseph Smith, and I want to know what is on the other side of the cardboard cutout, right?
Right. Because, you're raised being told he was 14 years old. He just had questions. James chapter 1, verse 5 said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. So he decided to go out and pray and ask God. And God came to him because he was so special and said, guess what? None of these religions are true. I know you're searching for the right one. None of them are true. And this is the case. So God and Jesus Christ are there telling him everything. And then he gets persecuted for years for having this vision. And this is, he's a 14-year-old boy. Why would a 14-year-old boy with, so little education be able to fabricate something like this? And then...
and what reason would he have to lie about these things?
Why would he lie about that, at a time period when people had visions all the time because they were on mushrooms and, not saying that part. Anyway, but...
Let me comment real fast before I forget about this. I really appreciated the fact that in that letter, he took the time to clarify the magical thinking of the time and place from which Joseph Smith came, that fortune telling and treasure hunting and divining rods and things like that were not just fringe little mythical beliefs. They were all the rage. Everybody was doing this. Was like how this was a thing, and you could literally go hire a treasure hunter to go dig stuff up for you. Like right, of course. That text really helped clarify.
We weren't taught that Joseph Smith was one of those treasure hunters, and he always failed with it, and he always had an excuse for not finding whatever treasure it was. We weren't taught that he used a seer stone. Nobody talked about that. See, and of course, I grew up pre-internet. I remember when the internet was invented, not by Al Gore. And so this was for me, these were things I was taught. We were taught very much that just Joseph Smith was seeking for the truth just like anybody else does, but he was the special one who was foreordained to bring the gospel back in all of its fullness, in the fullness of time. And he's the most important person next to Joseph or to Jesus Christ that has ever lived on the earth. We are taught that. Yes. So, you're told that. And then later, when he's praying some more, then another angel, Moroni, appears to him and tells him there's a book that he's going to be picking up and reading and everything, and tells him where it is. It's in this little box, this, stone box up on the hill Cumorah. He's woken up 4 times in the night, told this dream, same exact thing over and over and again. And then he's out working with his dad and his brothers, and because he didn't sleep all night, he faints. And then when he wakes up, there's the angel Moroni again telling him. So he goes and he digs up that. He sees the gold plates. And his first thought is, oh my goodness, they're gold plates. And then Moroni appears again and is like, nope, can't take them yet until you're ready to only read them, not sell them. And so for the next 4 years, he has to come back to see if he's worthy enough to get the plates. And then finally he gets them, and he translates them by the Urim and Thummim, as we were told, which was these 2 stones and hooked to a breastplate that he wears. And he's reading it through these 2 stones, and he's talking to somebody. And this is how I was taught, that there was a curtain in between him and who was transcribing it, and he would just read it. And the words would appear on the Urim and Thummim. And once the person writing it down had it written down correctly, he would get the next ones. This is an important thing that we got taught.
Oh, no, I get it. I totally get it. I want to make sure I understand. So,
yes,
because it's not been clear to me. So, and there's this term, this and Thummim thing, right? Which
the Urim and Thummim. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Mormon. I mean, there's some fun, goofy stuff in this. I mean, yes. There's language stuff here that is just, I'm sure, a study in itself. But okay, so so the story goes that there's a breastplate and a couple rocks. Mm-hmm. And are the words supposed to magically appear on the rocks?
Yes.
Yeah.
They do.
So the way I was taught,
they're held up in front of his eyes. Yeah.
Yeah. So the breastplate was something that he found with the golden plates that had this little apparatus that would hold them up like glasses in front of his face. And I was taught that one stone would show what the Reformed Egyptian language is, and then the other stone would show the English translation. So he would read from the English translation stone, and that he would say it to the scribe, and then the scribe would have to repeat it back to him, and the next phrase would not appear until they got it right. So that's how we know for a fact that it is a 100% perfect translation that has also gone through thousands of edits.
Yes. It's more than 10,000 edits. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right, I am gonna laugh. Okay, so
you should. We do.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Okay, so that's the concept of how he read these things. Now, of course, in the letter, this story is contested. This fantastical, delusory story is itself challenged. That's not even how it went down, or how it would have gone down, or what happened, right? There was something else with these rocks and a hat.
Well,
yeah.
The problem is there's absolutely no account of Joseph Smith using a breastplate, using the glasses, using a curtain. There's no contemporary source that says that. It's all later generated by the people who are writing Joseph's biography, himself included.
So this was some creative writing on the part of some of his hagiographers later on, then.
Correct. Right. Yes. In addition to himself, when the church was caught in its most controversial times, that's when he wrote his own autobiography and published it through his own publishing arm of the church in order to deify him, in order to sanctify his early life and make him the prophet that he claimed that he would be, or that he was. But yeah, so in the earliest accounts, the available accounts, they talk about him using a stovepipe hat, a white stovepipe hat, and a seer stone And the way, and I'm sorry for reaching off of camera here, but
Sure.
I keep it on quick draw just for this purpose. This is the closest that I could find to a hat similar to what he had. And then he had a seer stone that looked like this. I forget what the kind of stone it is, but he would take it off. He'd place the rock in his hat, and then he would place his hat or his head into the hat in order to close off the light, so it would be complete darkness. Now, for anyone, for anyone who has done anything, any sensory deprivation work, you know that if you completely deprive your eyes of light stimulation, you will begin to hallucinate. Your eyes will begin to create images or whatever. So this is one of the naturalistic methods that is thought to explain how the Book of Mormon was actually written. Is essentially this automatic writing where he would get into this flow state of mind after staring at the rock for a long enough that his eyes would begin hallucinating words, and then those words he would form into full sentences, and then he would say those to his scribes, who would then write them down as the Book of Mormon.
Right.
So none of that information, the stone in the hat itself, none of that information is readily available until the church was consistently challenged and pushed and challenged on this. And it was 2017, I believe, that we got an interview of the standing prophet at the time, current prophet Russell M. Nelson, where he's sitting in the Smith home in New York doing a face-to-face interview with one of the women in the Relief Society, and she asks him about the translation method, and we saw a sitting prophet of God hold up a hat to his face the way that Joseph Smith supposedly translated the Book of Mormon. And it only took 190 years for them to come clean on that very important piece of their history. Right. So it's and it's like this is just one tiny thing of historical controversy. When we take an expanded view of Joseph's entire life, right? This is interesting. This is important because it helps us understand how the Book of Mormon came to be. But the Book of Mormon is not Joseph's story. The Book of Mormon was his inciting incident. The story is his true story begins after the Book of Mormon is published, and that's where the real controversy begins. So, if it's any indicator how much the church has lied, the church historians have lied about the methods of the translation of the Book of Mormon itself, then that casts into doubt everything they have ever published on the life and times of Joseph Smith. And that has forced biographers to write increasingly more accurate and more naturalistic biographies of Joseph Smith, and at various times faced repercussions for it. One of the most noted biographers. Let me introduce a concept. There's what's known as Old Mormon history, or there was the Standard Mormon history, which was very polemical. It was done by church historians, and the church was the strongest publishing arm about its own history for 120 years or so. Then there came along this concept of New Mormon history. And this was an academic push by historians who were working with the church, who were working with other restoration churches, other Mormon churches, not just the Salt Lake City LDS Church, but other traditions like the RLDS at the time. Now it's Community of Christ, like the Bickertonites, like the Strangites, so on and so forth. Those historians were all saying, hey, we need to be honest about this history. And there became this grassroots movement to publish academic Mormon history. And that became New Mormon history because it's trying to get away from the old polemical roots, the magic and stuff in the sense of the way that Joseph Smith claimed, and the magic as in the sense of the occult, that he was using seer stones, that he was a water witch for some period of time, that he was using witching wands, that he was doing these ceremonial practices. He's sacrificing black weather. May have sacrificed a dog at some point, right? So it's trying to take off that religious veneer off of Joseph Smith and apply a secular, academically sound history to him. So the first biography that was written with this idea of New Mormon history was in 1945 by Fawn Brody. This is it. It's called No Man Knows My History. And this book was reviled by the church. She was excommunicated for it. It's notable that she was the niece to the prophet at the time, David O. McKay. So she had access to archives that no historian ever had access to. And therefore, she filled this book with secret information. information that was closed to research. And it became kind of this watershed moment of like, oh, Joseph Smith was actually not a very good guy. He was kind of a monster. And then, the title of it, No Man Knows My History, that actually comes from his essentially his final hurrah, one of his last sermons that he gave before he was assassinated. When it's called the King Follett Discourse, and he's speaking on these very expansive theological ideas, this council of gods about humans becoming gods and deification, and he's interweaving Hebrew and German and all sorts of things. It's kind of his magnum opus speech, and it's not canonized. I think it should be canonized for the theological ramifications of it. But in it, he says, I could tell you about my life and you wouldn't believe me. No man knows my history. I could scarcely believe it had I not lived through it. So it's notable that it's like even he at the time is like, yeah, I am one hell of a controversial dude. Nobody would believe you if I told you everything that I've done. And the more that historians examine the life and times of Joseph Smith through a modern and academically sound lens, the more he is revealed to be the cult leader, the populist, the demagogue with the despotic leanings that many cult leaders are.
Yeah, absolutely. I gotta say right now, the parallels are they're staggering between L. Ron Hubbard and Joseph Smith. And
it's a playbook, right? It's a playbook. And that's important to point out.
Playbook. Let me please say, David Miscavige, the current leader of Scientology, his niece wrote a book, right? Janet Miscavige. She's still out and about, right? And I mean, it's just funny to me when you said his niece. I was just like, oh, come on. Of one of the prophets, right? I mean, it's just too on the nose. It's just, come on, like really. Because the parallels between Hubbard and Joseph Smith as individuals are legion. It's not just a playbook. It's the character of the man. It's, also, and it speaks to the kind of person who would do what, Joseph Smith did, right? Marry, what was it, 34, 42 women or something like that.
Yes, the numbers are all over the place.
Lying to everybody about it all the way up to the end, which blew me away because he had, he obviously had reasons to lie while he was alive. There were people who were very hostile to the polygamy thing, but everybody he was doing that with knew that. So the more that it was such a self-destructive cycle to do that. Hubbard, same thing, right? He would just sleep with anybody. I mean, he was just a dog when it came to sexual predation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I also want to highlight, so a lot of hay is made about Joseph's polygamy, and that's something because it's so controversial and it's so in tune with sensibilities, right? It's so like, oh, why would God command this? God wants one man and one woman to be married and to have 13 children before they go to the celestial kingdom. Why would God command, Joseph Smith or one man to have multiple wives? So it taps into sensibilities, but it's also important to note that the reason that Joseph Smith the events that led to his assassination involved an expose that was called the Nauvoo Expositor that was published. And it was published by people who were the leadership of his church, who learned about polygamy by being propositioned by Joseph Smith himself. And then they said that was the breaking point for them, that Joseph Smith is a fallen prophet. And we are going to start our own church that believes in the Book of Mormon, that has the priesthood. And hey, if you want to be members of our church, we're basically Mormonism without Joseph Smith. And they put out an open letter to the citizens of Nauvoo, the Mormons, the almost exclusively population of Mormons that was Nauvoo, and said, hey, if you want to be in our church, You don't even need to be rebaptized into our church. We will accept your baptism into Joseph's church. We're just continuing on without all of the problems. But the problems that they revealed, they do talk quite a bit about polygamy, but there are other things that were far more threatening to the citizens of the nearby towns, specifically Warsaw and Carthage, who were full of anti-Mormons that hated Joseph Smith. And when I say anti-Mormons in this sense, the anti-Mormon party was a political party that was created to oppose the incredible amount of political power that Joseph Smith had. The Mormons voted as a bloc, and they were the biggest city in Illinois, right? They were bigger than Chicago. So it's notable that the Mormons had an insane amount of political power. So an anti-Mormon political party formed in order to combat their overwhelming power. So the anti-Mormons that were living in Warsaw and Carthage, those are the two neighboring cities to Nauvoo, they were much more frustrated about the political power that Joseph Smith had, the blending of church and state, right? He was not only their prophet, but he was their lieutenant general of the army, the Nauvoo Legion, which was, the biggest state army that could be assembled at that time. Some estimates are as high as 4,500 fighting men strong. That's a huge goddamn army for a state to have, let alone for a city, a standing individual city to have. And he was doing all sorts of political skullduggery that people really, really hated. And another major factor that really caused people to hate the Mormons was counterfeit money. My God, there was so much bogus flying around Nauvoo, and they could not target where the press was, where they were creating the counterfeit money, but they knew that Joseph Smith knew where it was. So part of the charges that they were trying to get him to squeal on before he was assassinated in jail were where the press was, where the counterfeiting press was, because it was just infecting and inflating the economy of the local economy. And all of the business leaders hated that. They hated the Mormons' business practices.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of factors that went into it, but modern day, it's much a lot of focus is given towards polygamy, like I said, because of our sensibilities. But there's so much more to Joseph Smith that made him controversial, that polygamy was just one of a cacophony of sins against his fellow man that he was committing that led to his assassination.
Okay.
And none of this gets taught. Especially. I mean, what you're taught the most as a child, because you start into primary when you're 3 years old. I mean, you're 18 months, you're in nursery, but you're not really taught much. But when you're 3 years old through the age of 11, you're in primary. And what you get taught over and over and over is how persecuted Joseph Smith was, that he was picked on from the beginning, from age 14 onwards, for only seeking the truth. And that's why he was murdered. That's why everything happened, is because he was the prophet. And that's what makes it all true, because they wouldn't have picked on him if it wasn't true. So you get that persecution narrative that is just ingrained in you from the beginning, so that when questions come up, you think, oh, this is Satan trying to destroy me, not, oh, that's a pretty damn good question.
Right. Yeah. And no, it's a really, really good point you're making. And of course, that is the whole point of a hagiography, right? Is here's the story. Here it is. You don't have to look at any other sources. In fact, if you do, and you start considering those, that itself could become a sin, right? Or
yes, you're told you're allowing Satan into you when you read those things. You don't need to read them. You already have a testimony. You don't need to question it. So, when you hear about things like, oh, Joseph Smith got tarred and feathered, these people came after him, it's because he was the prophet, not because he was grabbing 14-year-old girls and their fathers were angry as fuck for good reason. No, you're never told that.
Right.
You're never told he's a pedophile. You're told, oh, he's a true prophet.
Yeah, it's quite wild, the apologism and excuses that are made for even at that time. I mean, it's not even a matter of changing cultures or times. Even at that time, people wanted to kill him for the crap he was getting up to.
Yes.
And no. It's all whitewashed and sane and made very, very rational.
And another thing to remember too, like with the counterfeiting, That was a death penalty offense. You know, in federal laws in the United States, that was one that was death penalty for sure. That's a big deal.
Oh, that's good to know. That's good to know. I did not know that. In fact, I did not know about the counterfeiting at all. But
Nobody likes to talk about it. Yeah.
But I was aware of the fact that there were these that there was a large group of people, and that they were not particularly wanted, and that they were trying to set down stakes and trying to take over a place, right? Which is kind of what we see cults do, and this is not unusual. If you watch Wild Wild West, you can see, them try to a whole different cult, all right, from the east, try to take over an entire town in Oregon. I mean, Clearwater, Florida is half owned by Scientologists. It's not this is not an unheard of thing or unique to the Mormons, but during the mid 1800s. They were, but that power grab, I think, is more the story of why they were so not liked where they went, right?
Well, I try and apply what the trends of Joseph Smith's time to our modern ideas, our modern sensibilities, right? And it's much more. I think it's much more within our modern cultural zeitgeist to use like a Muslim extremist cult as an example to this, because there is enough of a living memory of Muslim terrorism in our minds that we can hearken to. Because in Joseph Smith's time, in the citizens of the neighboring towns to Nauvoo was a stronghold. There was within living memory the Missouri Mormon War of 1838 for them. They understood that the Mormons had committed war against the state, and now they were moving en masse into their state. What was going to happen, right? So using like the idea of like a Muslim extremist cult. Picture one of these moving into like a main throughway on like I-80 near in Colorado or Wyoming or something like this. Okay. A main business route that bears a huge percentage of the commerce. And this is likened to the Mississippi River. That's why Nauvoo was such a desirable place, was because it was right on the Mississippi River. This is the biggest shipping lane in the entire United States. So imagine a religious extremist cult setting up shop in a very deserted, fairly not well-populated area, and building a city the size of Denver, and creating their own army, their own weapons. They had their own arms manufacturer in Nauvoo. They had so much political power, and they now they have enough people living there that they are now able to sway state level politics and get their own people appointed to state level executive offices. How would the citizens of Wyoming react to that? How would the citizens of Colorado react to something like this? What would they do? How would people interact with this cult? They would not be a big fan, right? Especially with it being militarized and performing military drills on a weekly basis, and military parades every major holiday, or there were numerous examples, but there was one specific example of this when Joseph Smith was arrested in 1843 in Dixon, Illinois. He was arrested on the old Missouri charges, which the Missouri charges were from the Missouri Mormon War. He was interred into prison for arson, for murder, for larceny, for high treason. There are a few other sundry charges in there. So he faced numerous capital charges in Missouri, and he escaped prison. He bought off the jail guards with a promise of a barrel of whiskey and $50, and he was able to escape prison, and he died as a fugitive of the state of Missouri. Well, the Missouri governor swore out a writ of extradition that was also signed by the Illinois governor at the time, that would get the marshals legal authority to extradite Joseph Smith from Illinois to Missouri, where he could be held over on and tried on those old capital offenses from the Missouri Mormon War. So while he was being carted through back roads, through any way that the constables could get him transported across the state line and not be detected, he had his boys, his Danites, as they were known, the Destroying Angels, his Shadow Assassin Squad, canvass the entire state and all of the routes that they could have taken to get him back to Missouri. And when the Danites found the men who had Joseph Smith in their custody, who were attempting to make this arrest, they arrested the constables. And they brought the constables and Joseph Smith into Nauvoo. And all of this was very, very hostile. And this was all a powder keg moment. The Illinois and Missouri were on the brink of civil war with each other because of the Mormon problem. So he had his Danites, his boys, bring the arresting sheriffs and himself into Nauvoo. And when they arrived, of course, the Nauvoo Legion was out there playing with their, drilling and with their battle band out there, welcoming the prophet and their lieutenant general back into the city. So there were just a lot of things that revealed that Joseph Smith was an extremely dangerous man and was not beholden to the law. He had his own little fiefdom in Nauvoo, and nobody could touch him there. And anybody that came into the city to try and arrest him, it didn't matter how sound, how bulletproof, how good their writs were, and what governor signed those writs. It did not matter because Joseph Smith would not follow those laws. This, of course, generates a lot of really ill will between Joseph Smith and the people around him.
Oh, yeah. This is not.
And we don't have like a proper modern day example of what this looks like within a religious leader context. We do of cult leader contexts, cult leaders who happen to run nations. We've seen these things happen as well. But it's to say that sometimes when figures like this come along who come and just break fucking everything, they remove all of the safety rails and careen us towards chaos and turmoil and civil war, that citizens will react in such a way that vigilante justice is the only option they have left. And that's how Joseph Smith was assassinated.
Yeah, he was taken out by a mob. Interesting now that it makes a lot more sense to me why, when that mob was coming for him, his first thought, even to tell his jailers, was, yeah, they're coming to let me out, right? He didn't know who those people were.
Yeah.
He thought he was in safe territory, or that his people were going to take care of him.
And it's important to note that a number of the mob, the militia, didn't know that another militia that was coming into town immediately after the assassination had happened, they didn't know if they were Mormons or if they were an anti-Mormon mob. And so after they shot Joseph, they all scattered when another mob came in. That happened to be Levi Williams' group, I believe, who came in. So they were anti-Mormons. But Carthage itself, the citizens of Carthage, when Joseph Smith was arrested, almost all of them fled the town because they knew for a fact that the Mormon mafia would come and descend onto the town and break their prophet out of jail. The Mormon mob did not get there in time.
Exactly. That's and how interesting. It's such a story. I am very surprised that no one has made a movie out of that, other than the Mormon Church, of course, which is their bullshit.
Their propaganda. Yeah.
I mean, exactly. I looked it up, right? And the only real biography of this guy that PBS did something, but I don't know if their version of his life is this detailed. But it is interesting to get all the real, sort of rubber meets the road skinny on what was really going on there, because of course it's so easy, when you're engaging in historical revisionism at the scale that the Mormons are, to just say, oh, no, it was all just religious persecution of a misunderstood prophet. It's so easy to do that. And unfortunately, unless you're really interested in this kind of stuff, it's not hard to get the details, but it does take some time to go dig all this stuff up.
Well, and briefly on the note of hagiography, I think it's important to note that, like I said, at the most controversial times of church history is usually when Joseph Smith was writing his own biographies. He was writing his own legendary stories to deify his position, to sanctify his actions. And so he recognized the importance of controlling his own narrative while he was alive. But after he died, right? He didn't expect to die. Nobody expected him to die when he did die. But he did. That's just how, political assassinations go, right? In any case, though, immediately after his death, his friend, one of his closest friends, Brigham Young, recognized that Joseph Smith was a controversial son of a bitch and that Brigham Young needed to control the narrative. It's notable as well that one of the ways that Brigham Young came into the true filial trust of Joseph Smith, was when Joseph's own quorum of apostles were planning to assassinate him. When he was riding into town, Brigham Young rode out to meet Joseph Smith and inform him that the assassination plot was taking place, and therefore protected Joseph from dying in 1836. That is what elevated Brigham Young to be of the trusted elite status. And importantly, during the Missouri Mormon War, when there were more than 16 Mormon leaders that were arrested, Joseph Smith included, and in Missouri jails before most of them escaped, Brigham Young was one of the highest ranking individuals in the church who was not in prison and was able to coordinate. He was a very good businessman. He was able to coordinate the resettlement effort from Missouri into Illinois that led to the Nauvoo settlement. So that's where Brigham Young garnered a lot of trust of the standard everyday Mormons who were making the sojourn across the Mississippi River. So that this.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I was going to say this shows where Brigham Young and Joseph Smith kind of forged their bond, and where Brigham Young recognized how controversial Joseph Smith was as a character. He had his cousin set out to write the history of the church, Willard Richards, and he compiled a 6-volume set that became the history of the church. And it wasn't. It was published in series in the Deseret News through the 1850s. But then was finally collected into book format and published in the early 1900s by the church historian B.H. Roberts. And that's this volume set, History of the Church. So you can find a bunch of different kinds of it. But it's really notable that this was church historians working on behalf of Brigham Young and the church itself to write the history of Joseph Smith's era of church. Their own era that has yet to be fully written. But this is, of the Joseph Smith era. But they have all of the documents in their own archives that they choose which documents make it into the history. They choose which documents don't, which documents get ignored. They chose this in the 1850s when this project was conceived. And B.H. Roberts put the seal on it when he finally published the history of the church. It wasn't until 2015 that we got one of the community's most fastidious historians, Dan Vogel, to write this. And this is called the Source and Text Critical Edition of the History of the Church. And essentially what Dan Vogel does is he goes and finds all of the documents that were used to write the history of the church, and he restores them to their original form. So let me find... So here's a great example of this. So throughout this, he has just in regular font all of the information that's in the actual official history of the church, and then he has added in bold everything that was in the documents that was cut out, or everything that was in the original draft of the history of the church that was cut out for publication or whatever. So he's restoring the history of the church to its most accurate, most documentary soundly version of what he was able to find. And if you look, here's just one sample, right? So if you look on this page, you have a bit that is the original text, but almost that like that entire letter right here is alluded to in the history of the church, but it was cut from the history of the church. So he restores the original document.
Got it.
So, but that's also, just remember, like, this is also the documents that they chose to include, that they chose to cite in their own original history of the church. That's what he is working with here. So it's one of the best histories that we have, one of the best documentary repositories that we have of church history, but it still has all of the selection bias that the original historians used when they were compiling their original history.
Right.
So for that, there's so many other documents, so many other repositories, so many other places to find documents and to find the actual academic history here, that when the longer you study the propagandized history, the more you realize how polemical it is. You realize how fabricated and how legendary it is. And the more you begin to understand the academic version of Mormon history, the new Mormon history, I'll bring up that term again, the more you realize that Joseph Smith was just not a good guy. And the people who shot him on June 27th, 1844, were damn justified in what they did.
Absolutely. No, I get that completely. In fact, this brings to mind a question I wrote down while I was reading the letter that I wanted to ask you guys about, it's a kind of a fine point on what you were just talking about, or building on what you were just talking about, because clearly, while putting together or compiling information, you have a narrative. And they want to feed that narrative, and then it's confirmation bias, right? Let's find everything that feeds that narrative, and let's erase and destroy from history anything, or just remove it, anything that doesn't conform with this narrative. And the narrative obviously being, when you're compiling a church history, the unspoken, theme here is all the good stuff, right? Because it can only be all the good stuff, right? We can't talk about revolts and civil war and upsetting the apple cart everywhere they went because they were power hungry religious fanatics. We can't talk about that. We can't put it that way. So we have to we got to frame it along this narrative. But along the way, for the last 200 years, right, there have been people such as yourselves who come along and go, nap, poke a hole here, poke a hole there, poke a hole there. Has the church, with so much specific, here's what I wrote, with so much specific debunking done, such as the letter to the CES Letter, has the church started trying to change the records using the debunk material as a guide? Like, oh, they know about this. Okay, let's go find every example of this and destroy it, remove it from the internet, take it away from our genealogical records. I was fascinated to find, for example, in the letter, he says, I can show you most of my claims using Mormon documentation and history. I mean, it's all there, right? Joseph Smith's polygamy, it's right there in the historical genealogical records. It's right there, right? Do they go back as a result of things like that and take it away? So it's not in the historical record anymore.
Yes, and that has been the subject of numerous lawsuits that are currently active against the church.
Really?
The most notable of these is John Huntsman. Huntsman is a very well-known Blue Mormon blood pioneer heritage name. Very wealthy, powerful family in Utah who have collectively, who knows how many hundreds of millions the Huntsman family has given to the church. Who knows? It's insane. Anyway, so John Huntsman is suing the church to get his tithing back because he was sold a false bill of goods. He claimed that there was fraudulent inducement in the way that the church used its finances, and that had he been aware of how the church had used its finances, then he would not have given the tithing to the church. But part of that lawsuit and part of the numerous other lawsuits that are active against the church is its own misrepresentation of its own history. And included in that, in exhibits in that case and in the Gaddy v. LDS case and a number of the other cases, are the exhibits of the artwork that the church has put out there of Joseph Smith with the stone plate, with the glasses, reading gold plates. Well, we know the church has known for well over 100 years at this point that there's no document that backs up that version. So the version that is more accurate is Joseph Smith put his face into a hat. And the claim is that had we known this detail, had I not been lied to about this detail, I never would have been a member of this church. I never would have given tithing to the church. Therefore, I want my tithing back. I want damages for the fraudulent inducement to be a member of your cult. So it's interesting. And the church recognizes that this is a legal liability for them. They have lied about their history. They have deliberately obfuscated its history. And now it's being sued because it has lied about this history. So they've made small concessions. 2015 was when we've got a picture, an actual picture of the actual seer stone published on the church's own website. That was a watershed moment for historians. No historians thought that that was actually going to happen, and then they just released it, and it was mind blowing in the community. It's like, oh, this. It was a moment of like, oh, the church is turning over a new leaf. We have the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which is publishing every single known document that's attached to Joseph Smith online and in book form. So there are no more secrets about any document that was attached with Joseph Smith. Ignore the stuff that we have suppressed in the First Presidency vault. We're not going to talk about that. But everything else that's been available to research, now we're making it available to all researchers on the internet, right? So it was this big moment. But the fact of the matter is the church has been holding to a historical narrative that is not tenable, and it has become a legal liability. They stand to lose money the longer that they tout false history, and therefore the economic incentive is there to be more honest with its own history. And there was just today, there was a Salt Lake Tribune article about the new comics that the church is using to teach its own history to the primary age children, like Shannon said, ages 3 to 11. And there are comics that talk about Joseph Smith having multiple wives.
Yeah.
That's never happened in the church before.
Happened.
Teaching primary age children that polygamy is a part of Joseph Smith's history, that's never, ever, ever happened before. But the church is being forced into a position that it has to be honest about its history because it stands to lose millions of dollars if it is found legally liable for lying to people.
Yes.
There's a basic question I have here that I wanted to ask you guys that was sort of the thing I wanted to get to today. Because there's a simple veneer level answer to this question, and then there's maybe a deeper answer. And I wanted to go a little more than the surface with you two today on this. And that is this very strange elephant in the room, I guess, right, with the Mormons. They have 200 years of documented history. The history is the history. It happened. There's nothing anybody can do to change what happened. But they can sure as hell lie about it, right? But the contradictory weirdness to me about this, even if we go beyond the cult thing, we just go, okay, fine, maybe they're a cult, maybe they're not, whatever. You know, if that's a controversial question for you or issue for you, okay, fine. It shouldn't be, but maybe it is. But even beyond any of that, if specific doctrine of past prophets can be fully canceled by current church leadership, for example, Brigham Young's Adam God doctrine, right? Just, it's heretical. No, it's not. I mean, they flat out say, no. No,
he was speaking as a man, not a prophet. Yeah, that's what they say.
But they do. But no. It's not church doctrine. Adam God thing. No. Brigham Young was wrong. Why can't they just fess up to Joseph Smith's proclivities, Brigham Young's racism and other proclivity, right? All the other things. Why can't they? And I guess the surface answer is, well, PR, public image. They don't want people, and yet they'll denounce Adam God theory. So there's no PR consideration there because maybe it's thought that is so heretical or so bad or so awful, this Adam God thing, that, well, we just can't go there anymore. Whereas there was a period of time where the Mormons very much believed that because Brigham Young said to, right?
Yeah,
so
about 50 years worth.
Believe that, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact say, if you believe that, you're wrong. You're just straight up wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, why can't they just, Joseph Smith, complete asshole. Absolutely, right? Wait, fuck the dog 10 times over, right? Like, why can't they? What do you think is going on there beyond? Well, it's just going to create a bad public image for us.
I think it's not just public image. I think it also has to go back to what they've taught members to believe. Because one thing you're taught very strongly is the prophet will never be allowed to lead the church astray. If he tries, then God will remove him from his place. And if they say, well, okay, he was acting as a man most of the time, He was just doing the best he could. It changes the whole perception and makes the prophet fallible instead of infallible.
Right.
Because the only way you can really keep members in is this belief that the prophet is always correct. So, like, I was on my mission in 1988 and 89. This is when Ezra Taft Benson was the prophet of the church. He turned 90 during that time, and they had this big televised birthday celebration for him. And it was incredibly obvious to everyone in this celebration that he had dementia, and the way he was talking, the way everything happened. And so after that, there was a lot of damage control done because people were like, I don't think he's capable of being the prophet anymore. He needs to step down and all this stuff. And so 70s were sent out to speak at state conferences everywhere to talk about that. And so during that same time, there was a really big excommunication that happened of one of the 70s. And it's the only Native American that was ever called to the 70s. George P. Lee, and he had been called under Spencer W. Kimball, who was very pro-Native American. He really worked for that, and he thought he was doing cool things with his Indian placement program, which is a shit show all on its own. Anyway, but he had to be excommunicated during that time. And so one of the things these 70s were doing is like they were talking about the excommunication of George P. Lee and watching President Benson. And they said, I've seen him as a 90-year-old man, and I've seen him imbued with the spirit to be a 90-year-old prophet, and emphasizing the difference on that. When I got back from my mission and I was at school at BYU, I had a professor who said, he needs to step down. He's not capable of leading the church. And when I mentioned it to another professor a couple years later, they said, did you report him? And I was like, no, why? And they said, he should be fired for saying that. He can't say that. And, the Q15 are the board of directors for all the BYUs. So, that kind of thing. And it's like, if the church were to admit that these prophets, particularly Joseph Smith, who started everything, was a fallible man, it changes the whole entire perception of the church. And that gives people the agency to say, wait, what you're telling me to do is wrong. And it goes down all levels. So, you have this problem like we had the Protect LDS Children thing about talking to children about sexual matters behind closed doors. And there's been so many abuses done by authorities, not just children, but to adults as well, over and over and over. And the bishops and stake presidents and mission presidents and all of them use that mantle of authority. God's not going to let me do something wrong. And then also we were always taught that you had to obey everything your priesthood leadership tells you, even if it's wrong. Because in the next life, when you go up for judgment, if you don't obey him, you will be punished for not obeying him. He will be punished for telling you the wrong thing to do, but you will be punished for not obeying. If you do obey, then you will be rewarded for obeying even when it was wrong. So so ultimately it comes down to this bishop tells you he wants to fuck you because he thinks you're good looking. You have to let him. If he tells you you need to go kill your next door neighbor, you have to do it.
Right. Right.
Or
and
you
Shannon,
believe you will be punished.
Right.
Yes.
apply this and make it real for us. What is one of the first stories that we're taught in the Book of Mormon, especially as kids, that comes along in the very first pages of the book that teaches us this sense of Mormon superior morality?
Right. So First Nephi is the first book of the Book of Mormon, and in it you've got Lehi and his family in Jerusalem who are told they needed to leave because Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, because that's just nature of all of the scriptures. And Nephi is the youngest son of Lehi. So when they're out in the wilderness, right, he's our hero. His oldest brothers, Laman and Lemuel, are the bad guys. Sam is in the middle. He's like, whatever, And so, but Nephi is the protagonist. So Lehi gets a dream saying, hey, we need the brass plates because that's the history of our church or history of our people and all this stuff, which ultimately what the brass plates are is essentially the Torah. I mean, that's basically what it is. I mean, it
Or the
doesn't say it
Septuagint
directly.
or whatever.
Yeah, those kind of things. So they go back to get him. Laman and Lemuel, Nephi, Sam, they're all sent back to go get him. They try asking for him. They try offering money for him.
Oh, yeah. And very
everything.
specifically, the plates are owned by an extremely wealthy, noble person
was in charge.
town named Laban.
Laban,
Bad guy.
yes.
Bad guy. We think he's a
the
bad
real
guy
bad
because
guy.
he's really, really rich, and he has the history of the people of the family of Lehi. So our protagonist just needs this book so bad.
Has
He
to
really
have it.
needs this book.
Yes. And Nephi, of course, his attitude, and this is huge. There's songs for primary about this and everything, is in First Nephi chapter 3, verse 7. I will go and do the things the Lord commands, for I know the Lord gives no commandment except he provide a way for him to achieve it. I forget all the rest of it. Anyway, basically, I will do whatever you say.
Yep.
So
He wants me to obey.
yes, obey. Obedience is the thing. So then Laman and Lemuel are like, okay, this sucks. We're done. We're gonna go. We're tired of everything. And Nephi's like, no, God said we had to do this, so we're gonna do it. We're gonna figure out a way. And he's thinking and pondering, and he comes across Laban for some reason all by himself, completely passed out, drunk in the gutter, and he sees him, and God says, "You need to kill him and go get the plates." He's like, "Why?" Oh, it's better that one man should perish than an entire nation dwindle in unbelief. So he takes Laban's
yes.
sword.
Importantly, Nephi is arguing with the angel of the Lord, saying, I don't want to kill this man. And God is saying, you have to kill this man.
Yes. This is in the first book, first few chapters.
This is something that's told to children growing up in church.
Carefully, but it's told. Yes, you obey. The key point is you obey.
This is akin to, what's the story about
Abraham and Isaac?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Exactly. But
except that he has to follow through.
But this is worse because God follows through. No,
yes.
Kill the motherfucker.
Right. Now, this is something that bugged me from junior high on, because I'm like, he's drunk.
Told to do this. This person, the person who has to do the death, that kills Laban, he's
Nephi is probably upper teens. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a teenager.
Yeah.
He's used to murder because God
to go get plates that don't belong to them, to go steal the plates.
Steal plates that don't belong to him because God told him to. And this is a story that is of why compliance and obeying is a good thing taught to children in the Mormon church.
Yes.
And no matter what God commands you to do, you have to do it, even when it is as unpardonable as murdering an innocent person.
Wait a minute. Isn't murder the unforgivable sin?
Yes. Yes.
No, disobedience is the unforgivable sin.
Disobedience is. They say murder is the unforgivable. Yeah. And that if you committed murder, you can't join the church. They won't even baptize you. But then they lead with a story of murder. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Only it's not murder because God told you to. Yes.
Oh my God.
Now, God's ways are not our ways.
It's like, now here's the thing too. This is the thing that bothered me for years. And part of why I read this damn book more than 65 times, because I kept thinking, maybe if I'd be more faithful, I can understand this, because I can't make sense of this. And I remember there was one of those times I made sense of it. But when I came back through to read it again, I couldn't remember what I thought of. I still, to this day, can't remember how I excused it in my head. But see, here's the thing. This is what's bugged me. Laban was passed out drunk. You can't wake up somebody passed out drunk if you shoot fireworks next to their head.
Right.
Why did he have to cut his head off? So he cuts his head off, and then he takes Laban's clothes. So I'm like, okay. He's laying there in the gutter, covered in dirt, probably covered in puke, covered in alcohol, very likely covered in pee. And now he's covered in blood. Because you cut somebody's head off, your heart beats all of that blood through these veins very fast. Oh. So he puts on Laban's clothes, goes back to the palace, tells Zoram, who's Laban's second-hand man, that he's Laban, and Zoram believes him, and they get the plates, and they go outside of town, and then he finds out who is really talking to him. And I'm like, what? Did Laban come home often covered in puke, blood, pee, and alcohol?
Not to mention looking 14 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Well,
this 14-year-old boy is my boss.
right.
that's the power of God.
Sense at all.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's where the miracle comes into the story is God changed his appearance to look like Laban and changed his voice to sound like Laban so that the servant would be convinced and would give him the plates. And then to cap it all off, we have a night of murder and burglary and impersonation. Zoram, once he realizes that Laban is actually not Laban, they're like, yeah, you can go back to Jerusalem, but we're going to kill you. So, they kidnap Zoram. They kidnap Zoram. And he becomes
dedicated to Nephi forever after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we get Stockholm Syndrome in the first chapters of the Book of Mormon, too.
It's so stupid. And the thing, too, is it's like, he didn't have to kill him. There was no reason to kill him. He could have just taken his clothes, rolled him in the bushes.
Yeah.
Why kill him?
I am flabbergasted right now.
And why would nobody recognize him when he had just been in there in the court? So Zoram would have seen him in the court asking for the plates over and over and over. So this guy shows up who they've already seen in the court several times asking for the plates. He's that stupid?
I am floored by this. I mean, okay.
Well, and let me just bring it back too, because this is all to say that when someone says that if a bishop commands somebody to murder, that they will do it, you might say, no, nobody would ever commit a murder because their bishop says they need to. Well, when you have stories like this drilled into your head from primary age, from 3 years old, we are taught these stories. Your sense of morality, your sense of human life, the value of human life is not on par with anybody else. Your system of morals has been co-opted and controlled by this cult. And 9 out of 10 people, when they're commanded by their bishop, are going to say, no, I would never murder somebody. And they're not going to be persuaded by the story of Laban and Nephi in the Book of Mormon. All it takes is the 1 out of 10 to be convinced that it is a good idea, that it is God's will, and that the bishop, or in our case, the prophet or whoever, is speaking for God and actually wants this person to commit a murder. All you need is a very tiny percentage of your believing base to be easy to radicalize to become an exceptionally dangerous cult, an existential threat. So that is all to say that, we are talking about hypothetical situations here, but they are not very far from reality.
Right.
Well, no, and I think 10% is a little low, to be honest with you. I mean, we draw these, we pull these percentages out of wherever, but the point is a couple things. So let's just because you heard stories as a kid doesn't make you a murderer, potential murderer. But the point is that there's laying a foundation here of moral foundations, as you pointed out correctly, of compliance and obedience as the feature of your life. The central theme of this is you obey when you are told what to do. And you're absolutely right that we have now documented cases and more coming of sexual abuse and liberties taken by adults in the Mormon church against children who are, who lack critical thinking skills, are not being taught critical thinking skills. They're being taught critical thinking is a bug in the system and don't do it. You obey. That's what you do. You're going to have a certain percentage of people who are going to unquestioningly accept this, even if you who are watching this right now aren't one of those people.
Yeah.
You have to acknowledge the truth that there are people who do buy into this 100% and will kill somebody because they're told to. Look around you. There are lots and lots of people on this planet who will kill you because a religious leader tells them to. Does that make it right? Well, if you're a practicing Mormon, you go, yes, if the prophet tells me that it's right, okay.
I'll hate doing it the whole time, but I'll do it. Yeah.
And if this man has the priesthood authority, is telling me to do this, it can't be wrong, or else God would have removed him already.
Yeah, the justifications for this just pile on and on and on.
They're all there.
But the key question here is, okay, so you believe that is true as a Mormon, and that's absolutely like your foundational thing. Did it ever occur to you that the people who blow up buildings for Muhammad believe the exact
same thing? Right.
Did it ever occur to you that
you don't think that way? Yeah.
happens, right? Like that's the part that is so unbelievably like just frustrating to watch this from the outside, where you're not committed to either one, and you can see the radicalized Muslim, the radicalized Mormon, the radicalized Catholic, the radicalized Buddhist, and yes, they exist.
They do.
All of them are absolutely whack, because you're being radicalized to kill other people over ideas. And it really does. And you've already shown a couple of examples just while we're talking today of this kind of extremist attitude at a slightly lower level than death. He should be fired for having said that the prophet is an old man with dementia. He should be fired from his job and lose his livelihood and career because of a statement that he made of an opinion about an old man. That's extremist thinking. And it's so common in America now that it's not thought of as extremist thinking.
It's not.
But I'm here to tell you that it is.
It really is. Yeah. That's one of the things with Mormonism is because they see it as, okay, we're never told to kill anybody. Of course, then we're not, it's not being bad, obedient, whatever. But let me give you just an example, personal example for me.
Please.
And this is one that actually kept me in the church 17 years longer than I would have otherwise if this hadn't have happened. So one of the beliefs in the church is about children who die before the age of 8. Joseph Smith came up with this, and he says that children who die before the age of 8 are automatically given exaltation, which that's that top level of the celestial kingdom where you get to become gods, right? But we are also taught that you have to do all the covenants to get into there, which includes, the baptism, the temple endowment covenants, and getting married, celestial marriage, being sealed together and living a celestial marriage to get there. However, when they do work for the dead in the temple, they don't do it for children under 8 because their belief is that when Jesus Christ comes, second coming happens and all the people who aren't Mormon are killed and they spend the next 1,000 years doing temple work and all that shit so that everybody's sealed from Adam on down, children will be born, they will be resurrected in the form they died in instead of as adults, because everybody else will be just how you were in your prime, because that's what your spirit looks like, okay? So they will come back in that. And this is the key, if their parents have lived a celestial marriage, they will get to raise that child during the millennium. But if they have not, then that child goes to somebody else. Now, infant mortality rates, children mortality rates were much higher back then than they are now. But in 1996, I had a son who was born too early. He was 15 weeks early, weighed 15 ounces. He only lived for 2 weeks. So when that happened, what I heard the most afterwards is, you are so lucky. You had a child who was so valiant in the pre-earth life. He only needed a body. He's guaranteed exaltation. You're such a lucky mom. So I wasn't allowed to grieve for him because I was supposed to be happy and proud and all that shit. Okay. But then also, and this is the key, bishops afterwards, not all of them, but this is bishop roulette. So you never know what you're going to get. Most of them would use that to make me do what I didn't want to do. So if they gave me a calling and I didn't want to accept it, they'd say, oh, you don't accept it, you've lost your child again. You don't do this, you've lost your child. Now, losing a child is the worst. I was 25 weeks. I was sick my entire fucking pregnancy. I nearly died with him. And the thought that maybe I'd get him back was huge for me for a long time.
Yes.
So for the next 17 years, I never dared say no to anything. You have no idea how hard that is. Because just the thought I would be denying my child. Now, you don't hear this as much anymore because infant mortality rates are much lower and children don't die as often as they did. But it's still there. It's still part of it. It's still part of the control mechanism.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that's one of the things that made it really hard for me to leave. And I probably would have left around 2000 otherwise.
Mm.
Because I had way too many fucking doubts. And I was just like putting up boards on the door of my doubt closet that was like Fibber McGee and Molly's closet, you know, if you know anything about that old radio show. um, I don't know if anybody does. It was every time he'd open the closet, it would just like pour all this shit out of it. And you'd hear it on this old radio show. Anyway, so that was what my doubt place was like. And that was the biggest one holding me in. And it's the biggest amount of control. My spouse never got any of that. Ever. Not once. And when I told them about it, they were like appalled. They're like, that never happened to me. And it took, you know, there's a lot of people. I still to this day get random messages from somebody who's seen me talk about it somewhere else going, that never happened to you. That never happened to you. Church members wouldn't do that. Bishops wouldn't do that. I'm like, yes, it did happen to me. And I can guarantee I wasn't unusual.
No. No, this is leveraging that kind of emotional pain against somebody to get them to comply with your orders or directions is monstrous. It's monster.
It is. And it was 2020 before I ever really grieved for my son.
I'm so sorry.
Imagine holding that in that long.
Yeah, that's awful. It's
I want to very briefly.
Yeah.
I just want to expand it out too, because this entire concept that Shannon just talked about is predicated on this idea of sealings. And that is the teaching in Mormonism that families can be together forever. And missionaries, when they're knocking on doors, that's usually going to be their lead sales pitch. Do you want to live with your family forever? That's the best sales point that the church has within its theology and doctrine, is a very specific plan with very specific contingencies for families continuing on through the eternities. And that is wielded as the most powerful cudgel against the membership is the threatening of their families, family separation. And the sealing is seen as an opt-into system that everybody has to fully opt into or nobody gets the benefits of. So that is to say that when children leave the church, it's often seen as the fault of the parents who are stalwart Orthodox members, because what did you do or what did you not do that caused your children to break the seal that now means you are not going to live with your children in the eternities forever? What have you done to be responsible for your children's sins? And this is one of the most powerful and divisive factors within the church that causes it to separate families and causes a lot of families who try and live with a belief chasm between parties to not ever be able to connect authentically or to be able to share the same familial experience that they had when they were members of the church, because the implication is there that you are not a member, you are an apostate, you are an anti, you are an ex-Mormon, you are a whatever. Therefore, it is your fault that we are no longer sealed together as a family.
Right.
And outsiders, you know, not members of the family, will look at the parents of the family and say, you know, and lay blame at them in soft and coercive ways, the way that Shannon is talking about. They'll you know, allude to or talk about the actions of the parent being responsible for the kid leaving. And it's, look, when you are a believing member, there is not a whole lot of better institutions on the planet than the church for family experiences, for focus on the family, for being a family-centric organization. It's very, as long as you fit the bill. If you do not fit the bill, then it is an insanely divisive religion. It tears families apart. And any ex-Mormon, I would believe, I'd be willing to say, pretty much any ex-cult member who is watching this, who has familial ties in and out of the cult, you probably resonate a bit with this, that the cult divides the family. It is the primary dividing factor. Like I can talk with my parents about politics much faster than I can talk with them about religion. And that shows you how fucking divisive it is.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to move toward wrapping up right now because we've definitely made some very good points today about, the sort of the under the surface stuff of why we're talking about a cult. And really the theme today that sort of emerged from this is, again, the compliance culture, right? The obey or else. And there's something that needs to be said about this because there's, whether it's organized religion or ideological grouping or culture war groupings that people have become so divided about, this us versus them of if it's my way or the fucking highway. And if you can't deal with that, then get the fuck out, right? Kind of thing. Or I should even, you deserve to be destroyed, to lose your job, to lose your livelihood, to lose your life because you don't think right. You don't think right. You don't believe right. You're dead to me. This is extremism. This is what I'm talking about, right? And I get a little frustrated about it because it's so rampant today as a feature, not a bug. And it's a bug. It's a problem. It's not the thing that creates societies that flourish and create golden ages. That's not, you don't do that with authoritarian control. And that's the level of control that we've discussed here today with this, through the lies, through the nonsense, the historical revisionism, the stories and morality tales that all feed the compliance culture, that is this Mormon grouping. And it's so common today through the evangelical world, the ideological world, and the purity culture wars that we have, that if you're not, 100%, then somehow something's really, really wrong with you. And I guess I just wanted to say in wrapping this up today that all of that is totally wrong. You're free to have whatever opinion you want to have about anything. And anyone who tells you differently is literally trying to sell you something or control you. Mm-hmm. It's that simple. Like if we're looking for big principles, there's a big one for you, and groups that tell you, you can't say that. He should be fired for saying, it just speaks to such an extremist headspace that is one step away from violence, from radicalization. That's why I get a little about it, is because when people are there, that they're willing to watch other people's lives be destroyed because of a disagreement over a belief, you're right on the edge of violence. And there's too many people who are too close to that right now, in and out of the whole Mormon world. But we can certainly focus on Mormonism as a great example of how this is manifested in our society these days, and a group that is absolutely just off the rails.
Yes.
I really want to thank you guys for helping me to explain and see how that is true and how what the situation is with this.
Yes, you're welcome.
It's our pleasure.
Really, yeah. I want to thank you. Like I said, it wasn't really clear. You guys have been through an awful lot of stuff that a lot of ex-Scientologists would go, yep. All the same check boxes are being ticked. The childhood stories and control, the dogmatic scriptures that really subtextualize, compliance. Don't rock the boat. Go do what you're told. I guess if there's one thing that you could say all cults have in common, it's that, isn't it?
Yes, that's exactly it. Blind obedience.
Yeah,
that's right.
And we see things that are not specifically religion that also are using the same damn playbook and like you say, are on the absolute verge of morphing into extremist violence. And I want to thank you for giving us a platform and an opportunity to sound this bullhorn. Hey, cults are really, really fucking bad, and Mormonism is one of the dangerous ones out there.
Big time. It's very clear to me now that Mormonism is a far more dangerous group than I had ever imagined. I really walked away with South Park with a slightly off message on that one, right? Because it was like, oh, they're so nice. They're so nice. And it's like, no, it's like a Minnesota nice, man. They'll kill you. They'll kill you.
It's that Southern nice. Bless your heart.
Bless your
Bless your heart. That's right. So, okay, folks. Now, let me give you guys an opportunity to promote yourselves as well, because you all have a podcast, the GlassBox podcast, and what else? How do people reach you or find or connect with you?
Yeah, GlassBox Podcast is the show that we do together. We just started going through a series on the death penalty, a long-form series that also includes survey responses from our listeners and talking about how it's been exercised, the current legal landscape of it, and more importantly, episode 2, we are focusing on Mormon death penalty and the way that capital punishment has been used inside the culture of the church for compliance, for cleansing of apostates, for the scapegoating, and for all of those things. And it's quite interesting. Utah has been a bit of a bloodthirsty state throughout its history, and has factored heavily into the national conversation about the death penalty. So that's the series that we're currently doing at the time that this episode releases on GlassBox. And of course, if you want this serialized history of Joseph Smith in the church, that's Naked Mormonism. That was my solo project where I just said, what the hell happened with this history? I need to, I read the CES letter. I was like, all right, I need some context for this. I need to know, a chronological sequence of events that puts all of these historical data points into the context of what actually happened there. So that's what Naked Mormonism is.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, both of you, thank you very much for taking the time to help me educate folks. I really, really appreciate it. This is deeper dive stuff, and that's the whole point of the Speaking of Cults podcast, is to get into the details and the nitty gritty and look at how and why these groups do what they do. So if you've enjoyed this show today, if this has been illuminating for you in any way about the Mormon church or, how these cults operate, consider supporting the channel. Patreon is awesome. PayPal is awesome. Throw some love my way. That would be great. But regardless, I hope you did get something out of this today, because the whole point of this is not just to watch us rage. Being who we are and being ex-members of this, there are there's some emotional feeling with some of it. It's not just an academic ivory tower exercise for us. We've unfortunately lived this. And so a lot of what you hear and some of the teeth gnashing coming out of this, of course, is, our survivor angst. We don't want you folks to suffer the way we did.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, that's what this is about. And I hope you'll take this in the spirit with which it is given, which is of help. So, all right, folks, I will see you guys next week. And Shannon and Bryce, we are definitely going to be talking again.
I really want to get into the difference between Brigham Young and Joseph Smith and the way that they're portrayed. I think that's a wealth of conversation that was only very teased in this discussion.
Yes, I think that's in fact, I'll note that down, because the secession, let's call it the secession problem, because I'd like to talk about not only Brigham Young taking over, but how that secession worked, because there are stories there. In fact, there were other prophets who were trying to make a play, and even had plates, copper plates to read, right, and stuff like that. Plates. There is some fun and very, very interesting history here to go over, but always with an eye toward understanding what's going on now.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up the Vori plates. Oh my God, the Strangites, the Mormons who were pouring phosphorus on their heads so they would glow when they were endowed with the Spirit of God. It's like, oh my God, there's so much fun. There's so much. It's not all just doom and gloom. There's like quirky, objectively funny history within it as well. Yeah, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much, Chris.
Yes,
absolutely, guys. All right, see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.